when the religious authorities finally caught up to Jesus after he had been feeding the hungry, healing the sick, comforting the hurting. Jesus and the disciples had finally sat down to eat. And these religious authorities had heard about this teacher and prophet, and they were quite curious. They did not necessarily come with bad intentions like we might assume. Perhaps they initially came as the welcome committee from Jerusalem, a delegation to go meet this new prophet and talk with him. But since they were so overly focused on the fact that Jesus and his disciples had not washed their hands before eating, I am guessing that Jesus and the disciples did not feel very welcomed. Now, I think that manners are extremely important until they are not. Like when you finally sit down with your closest friends who have helped you unload the moving truck for hours under the hot August sun in Alabama, and the extra large pizzas finally arrive. It is far more important to sit down and relax and put your elbows on the table than it is to hold your fork correctly. Or when you finally sit down with your closest family after several exhausting days of sitting next to the bedside of a loved one and then gathering together for a funeral. That around the table, it is far more important to tell stories, to cry, or even to laugh than it is to have your napkin in your lap. I don't know why Jesus and the disciples did not wash their hands. But for these religious authorities, it was more than just about manners. It was about tradition. That we have stepped into a conversation that was ongoing within Judaism about the importance of this particular tradition. And there were different folks with different opinions. Imagine that in the church. And these religious authorities thought this particular tradition was paramount. And Jesus, who valued tradition, shifted the entire conversation by quoting the prophet Isaiah. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And this was not just blatant criticism, because if we keep reading in Isaiah 29, it says, God is about to do something new, something that would get everyone's attention, that perhaps this was Jesus offering an invitation to the religious authorities to see something new. That as it turns out, Jesus was an excellent volleyball player. That people asked him all sorts of questions, and he would just hit the volley back to them, changing the way they saw the entire question, perhaps seeing it up close for the first time, looking at it through the lens of those that it affects the most. As one author says, off from a distance, we cannot tell the sheer power of the ocean, that out there on the horizon, it is calm and flat. that we might notice the waves starting to form as they approach the beach. But it's not until you step out into the surf and you wade out into the water and that first big wave knocks you off your feet that you finally understand the power. That Jesus wanted to knock the religious authorities off their feet so that they saw this question differently. And for some time, off out there in the distance, we have noticed a changing religious landscape around the church, or the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, those who claim no religious affiliation. Many of them feel disillusioned or disenfranchised by the church. And looking at it from a distance, it does not seem that significant until we listen to those whom it affects the most. In 1937, the Gallup poll indicated that 73% of the people were members of a church. In 2020, it was 47%, the first time it had ever dropped below 50%. And there are dividing lines between the generations. If you were born before 1946, 66% of the people are members of a church. For baby boomers, 58%. For Generation X, 50%. For millennials, 36%. It's enough to knock us off of our feet. But as it turns out, it's not all bad news. In the recent numbers, there are indicators of things that could be changing. In 1972, Dean M. Kelly, a renowned sociologist, was studying these declining numbers, and he had a theory. He said, churches with strict rules and traditional boundaries were growing, while mainline churches like Auburn First Baptist were declining. It was called the Kelly thesis, and this has been the presumption of the day. But in the recent numbers, Diana Butler Bass points out that mainline churches have seen an uptick in growth, while other churches continue to decline. Now, this is just a snapshot in time. It's not a predictor of the future. But the reasons that are given for the rise of the nones is well known. That those outside the church, whom the question affects the most, see the church as judgmental, anti-science, too political, too consumeristic. They have ignored those who have suffered trauma or been slow to respond to racial reconciliation. That if we listen closely, we might hear those words. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. When I think about Harry Houdini, that elaborate escape artist handcuffing himself or shackling his legs underneath water for so many minutes, performing some death-defying stunt, I often wonder, why? That he would get up on stage and talk about the stunt in all of its risks, saying it was absolutely impossible what he was going to attempt to do. That he would have the audience sitting on the edge of their seats wondering, How is he going to do this? But maybe they were also wondering, why is he going to do this? That hanging upside down, high above a water tank, all strapped together with chains and locks in order to free yourself for entertainment? Maybe hiding a key beforehand so he had a way out? Well, sometimes I wonder, has the church taken notes from Houdini, tying itself up and having to find a way out? But it is not entertaining. That any time the love of God that has given us life and that sustains us each day takes second place to other things, we end up trapped. As Craig Barnes writes, history has proven that the church is never more wrong than when it is certain it is right. Humility, not certainty, is one of the great virtues. That humility is the hidden key that helps us to untangle ourselves. And one place where we can begin is by listening to those outside the church. This summer, I had the opportunity to sit down with a handful of folks who would check that box, none. The changing religious landscape is much more prominent outside the Deep South, but it is taking place here and will continue to do so. That I would meet them at their favorite coffee shop, and after a few minutes of talking about our families and what I was up to this summer, I would ask them their thoughts on faith, God, and the church. And they were extremely generous in sharing their stories. And their stories line up with the statistics and why they left the church. It was not for a lack of belief in God. One person told me, who had grown up in Montana, he says, I don't know anybody who doesn't believe in God. And I don't know anyone who has a problem with Jesus. Another person said, I grew up in the church. I even envisioned a life of ministry years ago. But I left the church because I could not ask honest questions. I knew there were certain subjects I could not engage at church, and all of my friends were not welcome. That he felt as if his faith would no longer fit through the doors of the church. Another person who grew up in the church watched her mother suffer greatly. Her mother was rejected by her mother's church after her mother went through a divorce. She had finally gotten out of an abusive relationship. But before her mother could return to church, the church said she had to make her case before the deacons. So she told her mother she needed to leave that church. And she left her church, but she said, I didn't leave the church. And I asked her why. She said, in the midst of it all, I decided to sit down and read the Gospels. And I realized this is all about love. That she needed to find a church where love was more important. We almost hear echoes of the book of James. Be doers, not hearers of the word. That she needed a church where there was more doing and loving than hearing. But don't get me wrong. I don't want to give hearing a bad name, because part of our doing is hearing the voices outside the church. Because it is healing for them and changing for us. It is the hidden key of humility that untangles our lives. That those kinds of conversations have the potential to change us. As one theologian said, we need 2 conversions. The first to Jesus. The second to the world. That our hearts need to break for the needs of this world. Like the church, the mason jar has long been a part of the Deep South. It first hit the scene in 1858, invented by John Landis Mason, actually from New Jersey, but don't tell anybody. Its design had this airtight seal, refining the process for canning food. But during World War II, the mason jar saw a decline. There were all sorts of changes. Even a changing landscape, people fleeing the farm and flooding the city, and refrigerators became much more common. That the mason jar throughout history has come in and out of use, constantly repurposed. And today, it's seeing a resurgence yet again. It's part of the organic food movement. Part of that yearning for something simpler. And when asked about why the mason jar is important again, one writer says, it's about a hunger for something real. And Jesus had a way of shifting the conversation to something real, to the love of others, because it endures, because it untangles, because it heals, because it changes. That when we make room in our lives to listen to the stories of others outside the church, it leads us back to something real for ourselves. In that conversation with the person who felt like his faith no longer fit through the doors of the church, where he could not ask honest questions, I told him a little bit about you. I said, I found this place where questions are welcomed, where all people are welcome, where we make mistakes but we try to emphasize grace. And he said, you know, if I was local, I think I would visit, because I need that kind of community. Don't we all? Amen.